For over 36 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke with BILD Situation Room. And it was merely a matter of time before the Russian army fully exploited the US government's decision to withhold vital information from Ukraine and initiated the first large-scale offensive against Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Here we see images from Kharkiv from this morning, witnessing the fires that are fiercely blazing here. We've had an extremely high number of attacks by the Russian Air Force, by the Russian missile forces, particularly targeting the gas infrastructure of Ukraine. We know that Ternopil in the west and Ivano-Frankivsk in the west of Ukraine were hit, that Kharkiv in the east was hit, that the Kiev region and Chernihiv in the north were hit, and also Odessa in the south was hit. So we know that the Russians took advantage of the fact that just a few hours ago, Trump stopped the sharing of information about when and where a Russian bomber takes off, when and where a Russian kamikaze drone approaches Ukraine, that this information was withheld and is no longer being shared with Ukraine, and as a result, the Russians had a relatively easy target for a massive attack. Tonight on the Ukrainian gas infrastructure. The Ukrainian gas supplier Naftogaz describes it as one of the most significant attacks since the war began, marking a major escalation in the conflict. All in all, this is the 17th combined attack. It is cautiously reported that there have been damages to various facilities. However, we know from images and also from information provided by local Ukrainian media in various regions that both pipelines, meaning gas lines, as well as compressor stations, substations, electricity, and even gas power plants themselves have been hit, creating a widespread and critical problem with gas supply throughout the entire country. The Russian Air Force is now immediately exploiting the vulnerability of the Ukrainians created by Donald Trump's administration to attack even more civilians across the country. From Ukraine, we now move to Western Russia, specifically to the Kursk region. The situation there is also escalating, becoming critical for the Ukrainian army. We're first looking at the map of Kursk here, and we see that in the last few hours, our map provider, Deepsda State Map, has made an important change here. Specifically, that coming from the east, we have a deep split here, a crack, if you will, between Gorjevo, which is still under Ukrainian control here in the south, and Sucha a bit further to the north. That means the Russians have managed to almost reach the border. Some even say they have also pushed up to the border here, and we've already discussed the situation in recent days that we have two villages here beyond the border which were attacked and taken over by the Russian army, and this puts us in a very bad situation as the Russians now have complete control over the very last access road. You can see them here marked in black. From Yunakivka in Ukraine, then into Sumy, entering towards Kursk, and then into the town of Sucha. This is the very last connecting road that exists in this specific region, and when we examine the entire map and take into account the distance, there are still approximately 12 to 15 kilometers left to traverse here that the Ukrainians have at their disposal to get in and out. And if you think about it, that all these small fiberglass-guided kamikaze drones have a range of up to 20 kilometers and you only need 6 of them from both directions towards the middle of the street, then it's an extremely difficult situation for the Ukrainers, who must remain highly vigilant to prevent being completely severed from their supply routes and potentially trapped in an encirclement around Sucha. We also have new videos from the Russian army showing these fiber optic attacks, and what's interesting and also devastating is that these attacks aren't happening in Kursk, but are taking place in Sumy, the exact area we just witnessed, where the reinforcements, where the logistics of the Ukrainers come in. Here my civilian car can be seen on the right side, but that's not the target of the fiberglass drone. Instead, the Russians, as we'll see shortly, are shifting further to the left and are now attacking a Leopard 2 tank, formerly of German production, which is moving here near Sumy, close to the border. We now see the approach, and we can also observe that the tank is in motion, so it's moving backward, meaning it's not an abandoned tank, and we can see that the rear track is now being targeted, that the Russians are attempting to fly in here and, as a result, bring the tank to a complete stop. Another video, also from Sumy, reveals a rather sneaky yet remarkably effective ambush carried out by Russian drones. We can see that this is apparently a checkpoint of the Ukrainian army, and we see a truck approaching here, and the crew of the truck has now seen that there's a kamikaze drone in front of them, attacking them, and they jump out at the last moment. We're seeing it here. They leave the vehicle and the drone strikes. All of this results in this narrow street at this spot. Now it's blocked. We're seeing it here on the left side. So here's the truck that was just attacked. And to the left of it, a Humvee is approaching, kind of like a roadblock that was set up here. And the Russians are once again using it as part of another attack. So it's the second kamikaze drone, which essentially just waited for reinforcements to arrive here, for someone to advance to the blocked road. Here we can still see the various trenches of this Ukrainian checkpoint. And this second drone is now essentially flying directly into the very heart of the area. He has, like the one we just saw, the one that has now witnessed the accident and initially just wanted to carefully check and assess what exactly has happened here in this situation. Can we get the truck operational again and so on? So this situation we just saw on the map, the Russians are getting closer and closer to the border and are now so near that one says, yes, if we sever the final remaining supply route in Ukraine, then the roughly 15 villages still under Ukrainian control within Russia, they'll be completely isolated and cut off from supplies. And accordingly, this is now the focus of the Russian army to target these supply routes, to advance on Sumy itself, the northeastern Ukrainian region, to essentially clear Kursk of all Ukrainian soldiers currently stationed in that area once and for all, entirely and fully. We just saw the Russian propaganda video claiming these fiber optic drones are highly reliable and always hit their target. However, we know from Ukrainian forces that there is a significant portion of them that either doesn't explode or crashes shortly before reaching the target. And now we want to take a look at such a video specifically of the unexploded drones. And this video was recorded from inside an armored vehicle of the Ukrainian army where the drivers had been continuously filming directly from the front. And now we're about to see how they get the fright of their lives, but nothing more, because suddenly, here we see it, suddenly a Russian fiber optic guided kamikaze drone falls onto their vehicle, but it doesn't explode. The shock is immense, but afterward you almost laugh about it because this drone, even, as we'll see shortly on the left side, lost its grenade when it landed here. The grenade is lying here on the left. We can see it. I'll try to mark it. This was just attached to the drone, so when it hit the ground and crashed down quite hard, it didn't explode, but rather it fell apart. We can take another look at it. The cable tie, which is visible here on the top side. The cable tie was cut through, sliced apart. And where the grenade was just moments ago, there's nothing left now, and a massive stroke of luck for the Ukrainians here in what's likely a Cossack vehicle that they didn't get hit or suffer any damage from that drone. The question is, how do you get it away afterward without detonating it in the process? Here we see another recording, in this instance a Stormer vehicle delivered from the UK which came under attack. And once more, the kamikaze drone, identifiable by its yellow structure, failed to detonate. In this particular case, the RPG-7 warhead is still attached at the front using a zip tie. Inside here, as mentioned, was this fiber optic cable up to 20 kilometers long, which is gradually unrolled over time. Nevertheless, this drone also failed to detonate upon impact when it struck the Ukrainian vehicle. And even with these supposedly perfect drones, the high-quality videos might make it seem flawless, but in reality, there's still a significant failure rate. And especially when we, from the Russian side, don't see how the vehicle catches fire afterward, like with the Leopard 2s, it's entirely possible that the drone caused no damage at all. Ukraine continues to rely heavily on signal-guided drones, and even these can inflict significant destruction, as clearly demonstrated in this recent video clip released by the Ukrainian army. Here we see a completely destroyed building, a small single-family house. Not entirely destroyed yet, it still has a roof intact. The Ukrainians strongly suspect that Russians are inside or that something is being stored there, and specifically ammunition. And now we'll just take a look at the approach and see here the Ukrainians apparently had very good intelligence information, because now we see here the approach of the drone and can observe that an entire ammunition depot was hit in this building. So it seems the Russians, while on the advance here, likely stored ammunition that was intended to be collected gradually over the next days and weeks, but they failed to do so. Instead, we can see that the Ukrainian drone was highly effective here and has now completely obliterated this house along with the Russian ammunition stored inside. These entire clips once again demonstrate that even these very small drones can have an enormous impact, especially when they strike the precise targets. But we also want to move on to Ukraine, here in the Pokrovsk region, and we have two new videos that show us that the Ukrainians are partially successful in their advances, but of course sometimes they're not. And that's why they constantly require new vehicles to keep pushing forward. But we'll take a look at that in a moment. First, let's see footage from Peshane, a village south of Pokrovsk, which was recaptured by Ukraine a few days ago. And we're witnessing these massive drone attacks with explosions happening repeatedly in this area, one after the other, non-stop. And now we're seeing the situation where, after the enemy, the Russians, were practically bombarded into submission, we have two Russian soldiers who are now just dragging themselves along slowly here. I'd like to point out they've come out of one of these mines located in Peshane, and now they're being attacked on the ground by Ukrainian soldiers. We'll definitely pixelate parts of this as the Ukrainian approaches from behind, likely throws a grenade first and then moves in even closer. And the second Russian, of course fully pixelated, is eliminated here by the Ukrainian. All of this unfolds during the ongoing recapture of Peshane, as previously stated, a suburb situated close to Pokrovsk. And right next to Peshane is the town of Shevchenko, and this town is also still partially under Russian control. Here, Ukrainians tried to retake ground even with this Bradley vehicle. However, this attack has clearly or plainly ended in a significant defeat. We don't know, we have no new footage indicating that the city is now under Ukrainian control. And we see, of course, Ukraine keeps pushing forward. We'll see it on the map shortly. There's certainly progress being made, with some villages being liberated, though it's still a long way from achieving control over all of them. And we can see from these images here that Ukraine constantly needs new vehicles because, naturally, not all counterattacks succeed and losses are inevitable. But sometimes, as we've just seen, they lose Bradley vehicles. Let's take a look at the map and examine the current situation around Pokrovsk. What we just saw were some recent footage that was captured from Peshane. There, as we've seen, the Russians were defeated. And on the other side, we have footage from Shevchenko right next to it. I think you can see it here too. The orange almost reaches into the city center. So that's Shevchenko. We know the Ukrainian forces are battling in the city center. They've managed to advance into the area with their Bradley, but there's still no evidence they established a foothold or fully reclaimed it. In that sense, the Russian video we just watched, which claimed to demonstrate that the Ukrainian advance attempt was halted in this area, nonetheless, as we've discussed over the past few days, there are additional areas around Pokrovsk that the Ukrainians have been able to hold and successfully retake. And overall, this is a more or less stable situation where neither the Ukrainians are launching large-scale counteroffensives, it's mainly sporadic, nor are the Russians managing to advance further toward Pokrovsk. From Pokrovsk, we want to head a bit further north towards Liman, specifically to the Serebryansky area. This is a forest where intense and prolonged fighting has persisted over time. Both sides have repeatedly attempted to push the opponent out of this vast and expansive woodland area. Now it has become somewhat quieter, but we have new footage that shows us that the Russians have certainly not given up, that they are indeed digging in at this forest and are likely waiting until, for example, the US measures take even greater effect and the Ukrainian forces start to weaken further. Have to thin out and then advance there again. Until then, the Russians have established numerous positions in this large forest area we're seeing here, and they naturally need to be supplied as well. And we've just received new footage from the Ukrainian army showing us that the BMPs, the infantry fighting vehicles that were positioned there or that supply the various positions, that they are still being attacked day and night, of course. Here we now see another BMP being attacked. In this forest, even though it has grown quieter now, we reported on it quite extensively about a year ago because it was a major battle that took place here. This continues in the sense that the Russians are still attempting to gain a significant foothold on the front lines. The Ukrainians currently have no effective way to counter this to decisively push them back. Nonetheless, we see that the logistics and the attempts by the Russians to supply their front positions every night and day, that this logistics is being targeted by the Ukrainians. So we can see it here. These would partly be, we just saw it, it's a sort of kamikaze truck. Here we can see it, the one that was used. We see it a bit in the cockpit. However, it's a civilian truck that was actually built for civilian purposes. Kamaz manufactures both military and civilian trucks. It's evident the Russians are using these large dump trucks to supply the area. However, all of this is being consistently thwarted by the Ukrainian forces. That means the situation in this large Serebryansky vault area, let's take a quick look at the map, remains relatively static at the moment. So here as well, it's not what some in the West are claiming that Ukraine is in such a bad position that it's being pushed back on a broad front. The Serebryansky forest here, just north of Siversk, is truly a very, very large wooded area. And last year we observed that because of the intense combat, a large portion of the trees no longer have leaves or needles. It looks somewhat reminiscent of certain areas during the First World War. Due to the heavy artillery shelling from both sides last year, a great deal of destruction was caused. Now the situation is more akin to a sort of phony war, with both sides facing each other and continuously trying to gradually wear down the opponent's strength. We want to head south in the end, to the Kherson region. Here, we've just received some fresh new footage from the Dnieper River area. The Dnieper is truly a massive river, serving as a key front line that separates Ukrainian-controlled regions from those occupied by Russian forces. And this footage clearly shows the fighting persists here, of course. Russia is trying to take the islands. We'll see that clearer soon. To supply them with new weapons, ammunition, and of course soldiers, to prevent the Ukrainians from retaking these islands and getting closer to the southern bank of the Dnieper. However, these boats are also anything but safe here. We see the approach of a Ukrainian kamikaze drone towards a fully occupied boat of the Russian army, carrying many soldiers on board. And now, I'll try to mark it. Here we see the explosion of the drone. And we can clearly see that it's an incredibly tangled and complex river system running through here. which has hundreds of islands that are contested by both sides, with the Ukrainians wanting to prevent the Russians from reaching the northern bank again, and the Russians, of course, that the Ukrainians launch a counteroffensive towards Crimea. We'll see the footage again shortly, quite dramatic shots of the Russians right after the boat was hit, scrambling to respond. The survivors are now trying to row with their rifles, so to speak, trying to get away somehow. And we can also see that they succeed because while there is a Ukrainian surveillance drone filming all of this, there is no further kamikaze drone. The next kamikaze drone comes into action only at the moment when the boat, here we see it, is lying on the shore. Here we see the boat now abandoned. It's lying on the shore and is currently being attacked by the Ukrainian drone. Because much like with other vehicles on land, the Ukrainians are obviously aiming on one hand to defeat the Russian soldiers, and on the other hand to weaken their logistical capabilities as much as possible. Had to also naturally target the specific vehicles, in this case, the boats here. Let's take a quick, detailed look at this again to observe. We don't often focus on the southern region, but even there, the battles are still ongoing. And here, this relatively small area, this orange zone, is the contested area, essentially this island-like terrain on both sides, or these islands within the delta of the Dnieper, which are hotly contested, south of that Kherson and then Crimea. To the north of that lies the liberated Kherson and the Mykolaiv region. That means even in this part of Ukraine, hundreds of kilometers away from the intense battles we witnessed earlier, the struggle persists here as well, fiercely defending Ukrainian sovereignty and independence.